Michelle Bruno. She is a therapist, and more importantly, she is a mindset coach. She works with all things brain and habit related, and that's where her and I intersect and overlap a whole lot professionally. Because as for those of you who do know me, you know that while nutrition is my expertise as a dietitian, I really am sort of the habits and the why behind the nutrition, so to speak, a lot of behaviors. So cravings is a very logical topic for her and I to dig into together, because it definitely lives in both aspects of what we do. And admittedly, we're both kind of nerds, and this is something that we sort of nerd out about a little bit beyond what a therapist and dietitian might know. So we're excited to dig into this a little bit. We definitely want to give opportunity for questions. And so we're going to make sure there's a little bit of time at the end. And if you have something that, pops in your mind, don't be afraid to pop it in the chat. We do have someone behind the curtain that is monitoring and moderating the chat. Devin, our soon-to-be ex-marketing director now. She is behind the scenes monitoring, and so she'll be able to chip in and let us know if there's a question that's really relevant to what we're talking about. And if it's something that we're either going to cover or whatever, we'll actually wait and be able to push it through to the end. So Michelle, go ahead, take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, this topic definitely comes up a lot with my clinical work, but also, I'm a professor of graduate students who are, like many of you, having busy schedules, trying to, eat in the car while looking over notes for class, like those kinds of things. And so this comes up in all facets of my work, and I'm excited that we can normalize and give you some tips tonight to navigate.
Yeah, very good. So without further ado, conquering cravings, the thing that everybody in the world, and that's actually something I'm going to take back once I do an explanation of something, but what a lot of us struggle with, and I can't figure out what does it now. Enter button, nope. Side button, nope. Space bar. It's the click, just so you know. It's the click. Okay. Okay.
All right. So we're going to tag team this one and talk a little bit about the differences between these cravings. And obviously there's some overlap as well. So we're going to untangle a little bit of what is going on. We're going to talk about the physical piece first and then get into the emotional overlap.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we talk about a craving, the first thing that I'm going to note is that the word craving does not exist in any other language. It's actually a new English word, which is to say that it was invented by the good old United States of America. But the concept of a craving is to say that there is a psychological component, and that's where the emotional piece comes into play. But a psychological feeling or a psychological desire still has a reference. And so one of the things that's really important to understand when you think about cravings is that a craving is actually not usually a desire for the thing that you are craving, but it is to say that that thing will provide you with what you're actually craving. And in this case, the main word that you're going to hear over and over again is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which is to say it is something that is in our brain that basically communicates and signals things. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter in our brain that makes us feel really excited, really positive, really euphoric. It is the thing that cocaine spikes. It is the thing that nicotine spikes. It is the thing that gambling spikes. It is the thing that bright screens and video games spikes. Pretty much anything that gives you a rush, dopamine is the thing that spikes it. And a way to think about it is that, again, it gives us that good feeling, right? That boost. And so what ends up happening is all of us have dopamine in our brain that allows us to deal with things. And our brain uses dopamine to basically have the energy to deal with stresses, to process information. So when you work all day, your body is depleting its dopamine reserves. And when you have a craving for something, particularly something like sugar or, again, all of the aforementioned vices that I would not advise you to utilize, what ends up happening is your body's basically saying, I'm running low on dopamine, I need dopamine. And so why this is so important is at the end of the day, we somewhat mistakenly identify, right? We say, oh, I have a chocolate craving, or I crave sugar. When in reality, what you're craving is dopamine, and your brain has just learned that sugar provides that. And so this becomes a framework that we're going to be able to really utilize and we're going to come back to throughout this talk. But for now, all you need to know is that cravings really are actually not a desire for a specific food. They're a desire for the effect that food has on you. And the reason that's important is because we can develop alternatives that do the same thing and might even have a better outcome.
One of the other things that's really relevant here is that there's really three categories of sensations that we experience if we want to kind of boil it down. There's pleasant, there's unpleasant, and there's neutral. And over time, the brain can actually pair neutral things with either pleasant or unpleasant. But the idea as humans is that we are wired towards pleasant things and away from painful things. And so that also plays a role here. So when stress is entered into the mix, you know, as Andrew said, at the end of the day, you're already tired from all the things. And you get to the end of the day and you feel stressed out because you're not done. That can immobilize the prefrontal cortex part of your brain. And what that part does is plan, concentrate, and use judgment. So if we are following a meal plan or something like that and stress enters at that point, we're already cognitively depleted. And at that point, we're not going to be our most reflective, intentional selves that are following along with our dietitian plans or otherwise. And so this is where kind of part one, where the motivation myth really comes into play, because we already heard this cognitive drain is happening. Now we add stress into the mix and the brain's functioning changes. So it's not about me having a lot of willpower or not. We're working against brain chemistry at that point. And so there are some things definitely we'll talk about that you can do with that, but there are some major things in the brain impacted besides the reward center. Dopamine also manages emotions. So in the short term, it's like, sweet, literally, yay, right? I feel better. But it can also, depending on what we choose to eat, can impact serotonin, which stabilizes our mood. So like the perfect storm comes together of cognitive depletion, fatigue, stress enters, all the executive functioning things kind of lag off. And now we are trying to balance. And it makes a lot of sense to move towards something that's going to give us pleasure and fulfill that need. And so that's how the brain is also just how we function.
Absolutely. And to build on that, right, we can hear, for many of you listening, there's that observation that, yeah, once I start eating it, I just feel like I need it more and more and more. And that's exactly what's happening, right? Is you get this spike in dopamine that feels really good, but then you get this drop that follows because you're eating something that creates a temporary boost. And what ends up happening is that volatility of dopamine is what ends up suppressing serotonin. So now all of a sudden that general well-being, that sort of like base that you usually feel supported on, that starts to get affected and starts to drop. And that's why these things can actually have somewhat of what you'd consider like an addictive tendency, or can seem to be addictive, is because you get to a point where not only are you chasing this quote unquote feel good that only stays around for a short period, but every time it drops, it's dropping to a lower base. And so you actually start to feel worse and worse and worse, which is why I use cocaine and cigarettes as two, because those are the ones that most people can like understand that we've decided as a society are probably not the best thing to do on a daily basis. But it's to say that that's why they're addictive, right? Is they create these massive spikes in dopamine and then these huge crashes, and people get to a point where they're like anxious or depressed when they don't do them. And so they start to fiend for them and get really nervous and anxious between them. And that's why you see people go from smoking a cigarette occasionally to smoking 4 packs a day and chimney smoking. And it's because their body, that drop between becomes absolutely just, I mean, it starts to really like almost feel like it's the end of the world. And things like sugar may not spike dopamine quite as high, and they might not crash it quite as low, and they might not suppress serotonin quite as much, but it's still the same system. And the reality is sugar is the one that's approved of, right, by vending machines and all sorts of our snack foods and that kind of thing. Our society has said, hey, you know what, this is one that's allowed. And then we see what the ramifications are as people end up getting more burnt out and feeling worse, and get stuck in this cycle that they don't really fully understand.
I think conversely, sometimes like that energy spike comes, we can also seek foods, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, for comfort. And so when the serotonin starts to dip, it's like soothing, it's like cortisol is going down. I feel more in my zone again temporarily, but our brains are smart. They're like, oh, that works, I'm going to do that again. And that wiring starts to, if you've heard of neuroplasticity, starts to make a pathway. And it becomes so difficult physically. We're trying to reach homeostasis and we have all these factors working against us.
Yeah. And so what she just said there too is basically that it can become a default, right? This system can become habitual. It becomes a habit, and then that habit becomes subconscious, just like any other habit. So now that's what your brain learns to go to. And we'll dig into that more, but we're going to be coming back to this idea of the default, because then we start to get to have a really fun conversation, which is how do you break that default? Oh, I should have been clicking a little more, it looks like.
All right.
Okay.
So, and hopefully we'll have some time to hear from you all at the end about what some of your specific trigger experiences have been. You know, according to the research, these are the big ones that lead us to. So physiology may not just be actual hunger, but it could be smelling, right? Or seeing something. So, you know, airport travel is a faint memory at this point for me, but I do remember like the Cinnabon, I don't know what they put in there, like you can smell it no matter which gate you're at. And it's like, I wasn't thinking about anything, and now I'm smelling this and I'm like, I really find out where this is, right? And so just smelling it is activating something that wasn't even on my radar. Thoughts can be the same way. We can think like, oh my God, when's the last time I had a Cinnabon? You know, we can then, thoughts include memories, visions, ideas, daydreams. Any of those things can trigger that path. And sometimes we're not even conscious of that, that stream of consciousness that's going. As far as emotions, this is one of the big ones. Like there's usually hard emotions involved, and people will emotionally eat. We hear that term too. And I know we just had a podcast on that. Mm-hmm. For some people, it's around deprivation. So if I've been trying to watch XYZ and my emotions kick in, then it's like that deprivation of like, I feel deprived, I want this thing. And for other people, it either can be something addictive or a dissociative. Like, I don't want to be feeling this stuff, so I'm gonna intervene. Situations can also be something. So if you're at the airport and there's no outlet for your computer and you had a plan of watching Schitt's Creek while you were waiting for your flight, also can be a trigger, right? So this one experience, all of these can be happening. The neural connections that we talked about, like I might start thinking airport and cinnamon bun, or whatever. And so those pathways start to come, and then it's not even a choice anymore. I'm just like, this is my treat for myself when I travel or what have. In terms of social, I think this is a really big one in both of our professions. Social factors include peer pressure from other people, you know, or somebody waving their treat near you. It can also be not wanting to be the standout person who's eating a sweet potato when other people are eating fries. And so that peer pressure or the social context can really trigger us to go along or to feel anxious, and then want to, you know, reach the homeostasis by reducing anxiety, reducing pain, moving towards pleasure. And so if you think about any of those factors, that's a reason why this happens. And we can start to learn, oh, I was stressed out, I ate this thing, I felt better, and now that's a learned response. And I'm not leaning as hard on my other coping strategies.
And it's worth noting that this whole system, right, if you notice that Cinnabon popped up throughout, and it's because something that is like a singular event goes through all of these within your brain, and that's really what almost creates that habit. And there's a lot of value in that. If you think back, so we're in 2021 now, we've had food abundance for about 70 years. Prior to 1950, there were more people that went more than a day without food than not. And outside of this country, that's still the case. But regardless of that, it's to say that one of the things you have to remember is that this whole mechanism of action was meant to be a survival mechanism at one point, right? Our physiology, being drawn to something or craving something, used to tell us what our body needed so that we would go find it or source it. And then thoughts allowed us to get to a point where we would actually like remember it, right? So that we would go look for it again. That's how we learned. It's how we didn't find the wrong thing. And it's how we would teach our children to find the right thing. Our emotions, right? Drawing that in, that allowed it to become something that was sort of ingrained in us. And so you can go through this and realize that basically what this used to do is it used to lead us towards making decisions that helped us survive. In a world of food abundance, and in a world where stress looks very different, right? Where stress used to be getting chased by a lion on the plains. Now stress is a deadline and a screen with a 14-hour day attached to it. all of a sudden our wiring is very different and our body's response may be similar, but what it's using that response for is very, very different. And so triggers are a really fascinating thing because they're actually based in an origin that's very positive, and more importantly, not just quote unquote bad habits go through this process, right? All things that become habitual go through this process. Anytime we learn anything, this is a positive reward system as a way to think about it. So it's to say that it sets it up to say, this worked for me, do this again. I felt good when this happened, do this again. And that's why it can become so easy to be the salesman that travels, 180 days a year, that doesn't even realize that he eats a Cinnabon every time he's in Atlanta's airport. And it's because that one time when he missed a flight and he was super stressed and he was, late to come home to his family, he sat down and had a Cinnabon. And in that moment of grief and frustration, something felt good. And then when his brain is looking for some happiness a month later, it finds that memory, it finds that thought. And I'll use that. That actually was an example of my dad, who traveled 180 days a year. And that was the kind of stuff that used to happen to him. But regardless, it's to say that this trigger process is actually both a blessing and a curse if we choose to look at it as such, because when we talk about rewiring and being intentional about good habits, these can be the way we actually intentionally create good things. So for example, whenever a client of mine moves to another city, so in COVID world, I've had a ton of clients that have picked up and moved to another city. And the first thing that I do with them is I help them pick out the restaurant they're going to eat at that's close to their house the first night they're there. And the reason for that is, as humans, food is comfortable, food is emotional, food is connecting, food is therapeutic. And so what ends up happening is inevitably someone moves into a new town or visits a new place and they feel a little bit on eggshells, right? Oh my gosh, like, where am I? Am I safe? Am I secure? Right? Our brain starts to stress a little bit. And the first positive experience we have in that city or that place tends to be the thing that we then connect to. And so most of you probably have that like go-to restaurant that your family orders from. And I bet it's probably one of the places that like you found very early on in living where you lived. I know over the years as I've lived in or throughout Pittsburgh, there's always been that like default speed dial place. And it's usually the place that I ordered from one of the first days or weeks I lived there that gave me a good experience. And it's not that it's the best restaurant in the world. It's that in my mind, it provided a safety and it provided value to me. And so what I end up having clients do is we pick a place that if they're going to become subconsciously addicted to, it's actually really valuable, right? So it's not the local cheesecake factory, right? It's a local place that has all sorts of cool farm to table food and vegetables and all that stuff. And they go have a date night there, and then that becomes this subconscious default. And we look for instead of a 7-Eleven or convenience store, we look for like a small little grocery that if they need to grab something quick, instead of picking up something in a food desert type scenario, they end up finding a place that has good access to fresh produce. We can use these to actually train our minds into good habits as well.
And two other things that popped into my mind around the physiology was the screen time, right? That's also going to mess with our sleep quality, which impacts the whole system all over again in terms of looking for energy, fatigue, decision fatigue, all those things that can happen throughout the day. So the longer your day goes, the higher your chances are that you're going to make choices that weren't on your plan for the day. The second point is around emotions, and we're going to talk about this on the strategy slide in a moment. We want to get away from categorizing emotions as positive or negative. So the language I use when I'm doing mindset work or counseling is around positive emotions and normative emotions. And so we do want to start taking stock of what those are. So some of the more common ones in coaching or in counseling tend to be around things like disappointment in their motivation or frustration or, being bored or lonely or angry. Again, like any of those things that cause the unpleasant sensations. And so one of the best weapons that we have is mindfulness and mindset to realize that we don't have to squash that urge to move away from the unpleasant in that moment. That's a myth that we tell ourselves, that we can't stand to be anxious or frustrated. And the good news is that we can definitely impact that.
Yeah, well said. I don't know if we'll dig into it at all, so I'll just reference that I actually talked to someone about that today, and it was the idea of high tides and low tides, right? Which is that our emotions, we like to perceive when we're feeling good that like happiness is just something that like steadily climbs. But the reality is our emotions can't just perpetually go up and up and up, right? There's a cap to that. So inevitably what has to happen is there's a period that feels really good and there has to be a dip after. And that's called a low tide. And so I love that idea of good emotions and neutral as opposed to bad, because the reality is the low tide is inevitable. It's going to take place, but it's only if you decide to characterize it as such. And more importantly, it's usually a period of time where we step back and reflect and collect and then go forward smarter if we allow it. So if we can take it from being a negative thing to a neutral thing, now it's sort of this productive opportunity.
And I think one of the biggest frustrations that kids will have is around thinking like the physiological things are real and the emotional things are not. And so when we're looking at emotions, recognizing that they're telling us something, right? We feel anxious for a reason. There's something behind that. It's a messenger for us. And in brain scans, when they look at pain for somebody who has like a depressive episode or some sort of, stressful situation, the brain does not differentiate in those scans between somebody with a physical injury and somebody that's having emotional distress.
Oh, wow.
So it's legit. It's just as powerful.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm not going to do this right. Click. Okay, there we go.
So we just want to give a small example of this one. So if you, let's say, are a parent, or I'll use my own situation, was babysitting my niece when she was younger, and this was the version of what was happening with her. And so I'm like, oh, I want to be like the favorite auntie. And so I'm like, oh, Mackenzie, well, let's get some ice cream. Let's make a sundae. And that would be fine if I had then also talked to her more about her feelings about what was going on. When we don't do that, what we're saying is, I feel bad, I'm going to have a sweet, and I'm going to move on. And so whether it's in a parenting role, aunt role, or whatever, how we engage with ourselves, the processing part gets left out. So it's not that we can't turn to something, food wise for comfort. We can, it can be soothing, but we also need to recognize what is happening. The emotional processing part often gets skipped. And then what we're doing is we're teaching that child to limit their coping strategies. Like, when you feel this way, this is the answer, rather than opening up all of the options that we have.
Great example.
So you can imagine a lot come from this. The hardest part about this vicious cycle. So let's imagine I enter whatever it is that I'm craving, and then I start the negative self-talk, like, I can't believe I ate that. It just undid my workout from this morning, etc. And then I might feel like really shameful and guilty about doing that, which again, it reduced my coping skills, because now my cognitive complexity is limiting as I get stressed. And then I'm feeling crappy again. So I'm like, well, I already ate that, so I might as well go get a beer, or however it is that people process that. And so over the long term, obviously that can pose health risks, not just for your physical body, but also for your mindset. We get that discomfort, that unpleasant sensation. We want it to go away. And so we do something to try to make it go away, which creates what we just put on the screen, and then it starts over again. And so recognizing, what is it that's happening for me? I'm experiencing discomfort or fatigue. What are my options? And you may choose to have a snack, but again, like, just being intentional and not letting it sort of rule you.
Yeah, and we're going to dig into sort of a framework here in a little bit that kind of helps with that when we talk about building your stress busting team. In my counseling, particularly in the world of disordered eating and eating disorders, so those that have sort of that binge eating or stress eating or emotional eating that's in a very heightened sensation, we see this comes up as sort of the 4 R's, which is restrict, and then resist, and then rebel, and then regret. And so initially there's restriction, like, I can't have this, or I'm not allowed to have this. And then we get to a point where we start to resist, right? So it's like we start to use our willpower. I'm not allowed to have this, right? I can't, if you do it, you're a bad person, or you start to say these negative things. And then you have this rebel, which is, what? I should be allowed to have this. And then that leads to an action or behavior that inevitably leads to a feeling of regret. And that feeling of regret will lead to restriction again. And so a lot of people get stuck in this cycle which isn't even necessarily negative self-talk, but it's actually negative food talk, right? And so that is where the list of, just like we talked about how there's, there's not bad emotions, there's also this concept of there aren't bad foods either, right? There are foods that make us feel better and feel worse. There are foods that our body digests better and provide more nutrients or less. But that's really never a game of like complete elimination or not. And when we get into that restrict, we immediately set ourselves up to have to utilize willpower because of the environment we live in. And that's going to create rebellious and resenting behaviors, which is going to lead to regret. And that's that same cycle that we see over and over again, where somebody can start off saying that they're going to take a month off cookies, and next thing they know, they're polishing off an entire box of Oreos. And now all of a sudden we took a food that 2 Oreos after dinner isn't really hurting anybody in any negative way, but an entire sleeve of Oreos as dinner, probably not setting us up to be our best or feel our best. And so we have the audacity in the United States in particular to blame the food, like the Oreos had something to do with that, when in reality, it's more about how we choose to approach it, how we choose to perceive it, and then how we choose to eat it. So we're going to, again, dig into some frameworks about that in a little bit. Click. I'll get it by the end of this.
So we wanted to give some things that kind of aligned with some of the triggers that were going on. So in terms of awareness, I probably don't have to say this even out loud, but the busier that we get, the less we are paying attention to what it is we're doing. And so when you are busier, we tend to be more impulsive. And so if I'm running late for a meeting or something is happening, we're much more likely to veer from what our plan is and just kind of grab and go. I think that happens a lot for people. And so being aware when you find yourself in that frenzied state, just noticing it is step one, because then we can intervene. Mindfulness is similar to this, but this is a little bit of an interesting one for cravings, because most of the time with mindfulness, we want us to really focus on what it is that's in front of us. If we're having a craving and it's become an unhealthy pattern for us, we actually want to use what's called a noting technique, where we just label what it is we're thinking about and then let it go. So there are some meditations that will do something like leaves on a stream. As you think about it, set it on a leaf and let it go. But we don't want to sit with it. We want to recognize it and let it go, because the science says that the more attention we give to the rewarding stimulus, the more likely we experience the craving. And that's where those justifications start coming in, like, well, I worked out 4 times this week, I should be able to, or so-and-so doesn't work out and they eat it. And then that, that can just unravel us. There are things we can do to avoid situations, right? Not always, but sometimes we can, like I said earlier, if we're using the airport example, physically keep ourselves not in that proximity of where we are. And if that's not always an option, we can reduce the exposure to the things that are, again, not that we can't ever have them, but if this is becoming a problem. In terms of the modification, we might want to use a substitute. Maybe I get a small version of a treat or do something in its place that's going to still make me feel like I'm engaging in something that makes me happy, but not sort of sliding down that slope. We can also do some cognitive work. And the interesting part of this is we can do reframing, right? We can kind of change the way that we're looking at it, as we talked about. But you can also keep your brain busy. And by that, I don't mean avoidance. What we're talking about is that your working memory is small. And so the space that the craving image is taking up can be easily bumped with something else. And the more vivid the other images, the more beneficial it is to be able to reduce that craving. And so we can use things like visualization of other things, positive things. I see myself, running a 5K or playing with grandchildren, or those, the why that we always talk about with these things. So find something to occupy your focus. Those are strong things. So the last one is sort of a flip of the other one. We talked about kind of avoiding or reducing exposure. The last one is like habituation, like put that cinnamon bun in my face and let me just get to the point where it's not that helpful. And actually mindfulness can be really cool here. I do some mindful eating exercises with clients, and this wasn't the intention, but people have chosen things, I don't know, like a piece of candy. And at the end of it, after they've spent 5 minutes focusing on the Starburst, they're like, ew, I actually don't like the coating that's in my mouth or how this feels. And so sitting with it actually changed their experience. So there are lots of strategies, and none of these are the right way. It's really about what's a fit for you.
Yep.
So kind of picking and choosing.
And that last one's actually a very, very common one used in the intuitive eating world now. So for those of you who have ever heard the phrase intuitive eating, the idea is to kind of reconnect your body's relationship with food, like, reconnect the mind and body and sort of alter that perception. And the response modulation, it talks about normalizing food, right? In our culture, we have this bad list. We have the good foods and the bad foods. And the reason that there's a list is because if I had everybody in this group write down 10 foods that they thought were unhealthy, there would be a ton of overlap. Everyone would write down the same foods. And it's because for some reason as society, we've agreed, and we don't need to dig into why that is right now, but it's just to say that what ends up happening is because we've said they're bad, we then start to feel bad when we eat them, which is why we then decide we're not supposed to eat them. And that's what puts them into the 4 Rs, right? Where we then choose to restrict them. We have to resist them because we live in a society where they exist. Then we eventually get rebellious. And then we get to this like regret cycle where when we rebel, the level of rebellion gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what a binge eating disorder really, how it propagates, right? It starts off as this small restriction that leads to this small resistance, that leads to this small rebelliousness, that leads to a little regret, and it leads to a little more restriction. And over time, it can get bigger and bigger and bigger. But response modulation is the idea of changing how that food gets eaten. So, for example, I actually did this in myself, believe it or not. I come from a disordered eating background. I was restrictive when I was in high school. And one of the foods that I never really learned to re-eat, even into my adult years, were chips. And long story short, I used to eat chips when I was in elementary school in particular, and it's when I lived in an alcoholic home, and I ate them for dinner a lot. And ate them as a snack late at night. And I'd go through a family-sized bag of chips pretty intensely as a part of an environment that probably wasn't ideal at times for a young person. But it's to say that as I got older, I had learned to eat chips as that coping mechanism, right? So it was that sort of emotional outlet or that safe place. And when I got restrictive, just cut them out of my life, and I didn't eat them for years. And then in my 20s, when Allison and I got married and moved in together, she eats chips like a freak, actually. And I mean that in the sweetest way possible. But she's that one person that like will grab a handful and put it on a napkin and eat it. And you just stare at them and you're like, how though? But anyway, so she kept little snacks around the house, and I just had never really kept them around the house. And when we first moved in, the first year that we lived together, I found that I either didn't eat the chips or I'd eat the bag at like 9 o'clock at night. And obviously dietitian Andrew was like, this is interesting. And so what I had to do is the answer wasn't to eliminate chips again. And the answer wasn't to tell my wife that she couldn't have them in the house, right? The answer was to change how I interacted with that food. And so I realized, okay, chips, they're a non-filling but very tasty food, right? They're something that they're enjoyable, they're salty. So if you're hungry and you eat them and that's all you eat, you're going to overeat them. They're what I refer to as a lonely food. I've done multiple podcasts on that, right? They're a food that if you don't give them a friend, they will bring their friends in the form of excess consumption. So I started to call them a side dish. So where most people call chips a snack food, snack implies eating it on its own. I call it a side dish for myself. And what that ended up being was I would only eat them as a side to a meal. And so I would have some chips with my lunch, or I would have chips as a part of a dinner, but I wouldn't eat them by themselves initially. And what ended up happening is then all of a sudden I didn't find myself eating them in the same environment, in the same circumstance. It allowed me to develop a different relationship with them, and it modified it and normalized it. So then all of a sudden my brain didn't go chips, overeat. And now fast forward, I can sit down and have a small bowl of chips as a snack by themselves and not overeat them because my brain is no longer tied to that mechanism. And so that's an example of sort of a modulation that's even a personal one. And in the intuitive eating space, that exists very frequently, and they're considered exposures. But the idea is, what are your favorite foods that are stuck in that 4R cycle? And let's include them in your day intentionally. Let's let you eat them without restriction. And what ends up happening is inevitably, right, we feel like we're not allowed to have something. We get really excited and we overeat it. The moment we give ourselves permission to have something, it starts to lose its excitement. And the reason is because dopamine doesn't spike. Dopamine spikes higher when something's not allowed. That's why a lot of vices, right? Drugs, alcohol, gambling, a lot of the things we think of as negative vices, those are the things that they're somewhat forbidden or frowned upon. And that actually makes them even more exciting, essentially. And so that's what we do is if we normalize this food, if we allow it, if it's permissible, then all of a sudden it's like, wait, what's the big deal? And it's kind of neat because you'll actually see, particularly in other countries, that a lot of this good, bad food list doesn't really exist. And so as a result, you see snack foods, you see chips, you see candy, you see all those things, but you also notice that they eat them completely differently than we do. It's a very neutral experience. It's not put on this pedestal. And that's part of the reason why the concept of cravings doesn't exist in other countries, is because they haven't created this emotional attachment to something that's basically been subconsciously rooted to be like, this is the solution to your problem.
So when you think about those things collectively, we talked about the dopamine and the issues with that, and then the stress entering, and all of these physiological processes going on. And then we look at the emotions, and we may or may not be in touch with our emotions, and that can be an intervention in and of itself. But this is why this is not about whether you have enough information or enough willpower. There's all these other processes happening behind the scenes that you may or may not be aware of. And so again, with the mindfulness part, it can be helpful just to slow down, just to sort of pay attention non-judgmentally to what's happening. So if you're eating the chips, do that without the criticism. Just enjoy and savor, and then move on. And so I think any of these strategies, you can find the ones that fit for you.
Yeah, that's well said. The only other thing I'll note about this list that's kind of a funny food realization is the concept of meal prep exists across this entire list. And so meal preparation is meant to be something that saves you time. And so something that's worth thinking about is meal prep is most useful when you're busy and stressed. But what's hilarious is most people do it when they have a ton of free time, right? So it's like, oh yeah, I had this really laid back week. So like I prepped my meals for the week and it was great. And then the week that they're super stressed, they're like, I didn't have time to meal prep. I didn't have time to eat. I didn't have time to even put my pants on half the time, right? Like they get so overworked. But then what inevitably happens is they still have to eat lunch. And lunch went from being like that meal that was delicious last week when things were calm to where am I, what can I grab, and what doesn't need heated. And so it's kind of funny because meal prep is an example of a habit, right? Where I encourage people to consider it as a habit that they double down on when stress exists. And so lifestyle habits, right, are meant to support us so that we can be our best. And a lot of times we think of lifestyle habits as these obligations, these things we're supposed to do. And then we use stress as basically this opposition that causes habit abandonment. The secret is actually when stress occurs, habits should be doubled down on. They're actually your teammates, right? So a way to think about it is stress usually comes from having an overwhelming list of to-dos. And we make the mistake of putting something like meal prep on that to-do list, when in reality, it is actually the opposition of that to-do list. It's the thing that makes that to-do list less daunting. Because if you take 2 hours and prep on a Sunday during a week when you know you're going to have crazy meetings, you save yourself a lunch and a dinner decision 5 days in a row. So you save yourself 10 decisions with one decision. That's what we call stress reduction. And so one of the secrets here, and a strategy I would recommend, is to reframe something like meal preparation, physical activity, right? These things that we tend to put on our to-do list as obligations, reframe them as your teammates and realize that when stress comes, the opposition isn't the meal preparation. The opposition isn't the workout. The opposition is the stress. Those are the things that actually allow you to combat the stress. And so if we can get into this sort of mindset flip where we start to recognize that our healthy habits are actually meant to be doubled down on when life is hard, and we get to a point where they become these subconscious, which is to say, I know in the last couple of months, I was experiencing something really stressful, and I actually used that to double down on my meal prep, right? And that's a subconscious habit, and I obviously live, eat, and breathe this, so you would hope that I could be that example. But it's just to say that like that is meant to be something that we can train, and we can actually set it up so that it goes through that same trigger cycle of, wow, that week that I was super stressed, those meals being available was amazing. I don't know what I would have done without it. Now all of a sudden the brain starts to go, oh man, big deadline this week, I better prep some food. And now all of a sudden we've flipped and we've gone from this habit abandonment to this habit fortification. And it's really come from literally this entire list of strategies.
Yeah, and to circle back to kind of where we started in that, looking at the sensations, meal prep in the beginning might have been something painful that you dreaded and avoided. And when we look at it this way, this is a pleasure-seeking exercise because it's going to bring us relief in a pinch when we need it. And, you know, science talks about we have a much greater likelihood of succeeding in our goals if they're framed in positive language, moving towards things that we want to experience more of rather than punishment through food or exercise.
Exactly. Well said. And I'll give a quick, just because, you know, food, I'll give a quick example. So one of my recent favorite meal prep examples that I did, I don't overcomplicate things. And so that's where I like want to give this example, because I think it might be a good one with some recipes in mind. It's summer. I'm a big fan of cookout foods. So I like to think of, you go to a cookout, think of all the cookout foods. When you're at a cookout, most of those foods are really healthy. The main problem at a cookout is that there's so much food that we tend to just like eat a little bit of everything and it feels like too much. But most foods at a cookout are lots of produce, lots of grilled items, lots of good quality foods. And so the other week, I knew I was going to have a really intense week. And so I grilled out 2 protein sources. I grilled chicken skewers, and I did like a sriracha cayenne pepper, so a little spicier. And then I did a pork tenderloin, and it was more of like a honey base, so it was a little bit sweeter. So pork tenderloin, chicken skewers, grilled, done, sliced them off, put them in containers. I made a black bean corn salsa, which was literally like a couple avocados, can of black beans, can of salsa, some tomatoes, some onions, cilantro, lime juice, stirred it all together. And I made quinoa, and in the quinoa, I did like some tzatziki yogurt and some lemon juice. That was it. And then I bought corn tortillas and naan bread. And for the week, I could choose from basically tacos or quinoa naan, but I could flip pork tacos or chicken tacos, which was sriracha chicken tacos or honey pork tacos, or I could do obviously the same thing with the naan bread. And the reality was I looked forward to those meals every meal, every day, right? I flipped them around, I alternated them, and they got me through Thursday. And I was still like, oh, that salsa. Like I was just so excited about it. And so we can hear there where my meal prep was still a positive food experience. It set me up to feel excited about the week. I felt like I set myself up well. It also allowed me to have appropriate emotional enjoyment over the week, which is to say the goal when you meal prep isn't that lunch and dinner become boring, because you need breaks in your day, especially when you're stressed. But when I got to break my day to eat like sriracha chicken tacos, that's a happy man right there, right? Like I was a happy boy. So like you have to realize that we can use meal prep in this positive iteration to be like, wait, it's not a chore. It's actually kind of a fun expression. And then from there, it can set you up so that lunch, instead of it being this chaotic, stressed thing that's rushed and thought of last minute, or this boring, bland, reheated thing that we didn't really want, it can be this really, really tasty meal that we look forward to. And that gives you that emotional benefit, gives you that boost. And that's where we just took meal prep and took it from being something we defer because it's like, oh, I just can't handle that on my list, to being something that we actually look forward to. And it makes our week better over and over and over again. It's one decision that has a massive impact on 10 decisions later on.
Yeah, and we circumvented all of the stress response and cortisol spikes that would come with that rushed around feeling. So when you're thinking about the emotions, it is really important to recognize, again, that they're not good or bad, you know, kind of just noticing how they feel and help yourself understand that you don't have to make that feeling go away. Yeah. So a lot of clients who have anxiety will say like, oh, I can't stand how this feels. I just need to make it stop. And kind of recognizing like, let me get curious about where is the anxiety? And if we have coping strategies that are already in place, like mindfulness or meal prep or exercise, we don't have to try to make a decision to try something new in that moment, right? Exactly. We have these things that are our go-tos.
Exactly. Well said. We practice them when it's easy so that they're there for us when it's hard. Okay, the stress building team. This is my favorite thing. And obviously on this slide, we have, make sure you check out some of our podcasts that are related. This season 2, we've done 2. We did an interview with Lane Greenewalt, who is the lead dietitian in our South Hills office. And she just, I mean, she killed it. That was actually one of the most listened to podcasts we've ever had. It gets referenced over and over again. Our dietitians use it as like training material. I find myself recommending it so much that I know that it's season 2, episode 7. Like she really did. She kicked down some doors on that one. I'm really proud of her. And then the Emotional Eating podcast, which was one of the first podcasts that we actually did in our new podcast setup with our video producer, Seth, and our media director or marketing director, Devin, where we actually filmed me and we put it on YouTube. So you can go on the Case Specific Nutrition YouTube channel now. And if you don't get enough of my face and my voice, you can now get me in high def. But anyway, the Emotional Eating podcast was two podcasts ago, right? I'm being told 2. So these are a couple, but one of my favorite mindsets, so what we've kind of hinted at and talked through thus far, is that cravings are actually your brain asking you for a pick-me-up. That's really what it is. I don't care if it's sugar. I don't care if it's chocolate. I don't care if it's a cheeseburger and French fries. I don't care if it's ice cream. Doesn't matter what it is. The brain is literally saying, make me happy right now. I am drained. My dopamine and my serotonin, which as a side note are the 2 happiness neurotransmitters that we have consistently. The other 2, oxytocin and endorphins, are what we would call sort of our temporary or acute. So we have 4 hormones, they're neurotransmitters that make us feel happy. I did a podcast on this, season 1, episode 40, Dose Your Brain, DOSE, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins. They're the 4 things that make us feel happiness. Oxytocin and endorphins are not something that we can necessarily like live on day to day. Endorphins come from physical pain, so exercise spikes them. Oxytocin is actually like a calming sensation. Intimacy, particularly physical intimacy, but also just emotional intimacy in general is the best way to spike oxytocin. Cuddling is actually the best way to spike oxytocin. But dopamine and serotonin, the D and the S in that dose, are the ones that we live on, right? I mean, 33% of Americans take an SSRI, an antidepressant. That is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It enhances your body's action of serotonin, keeps it concentrated in the body. Most of us, or most people, have some sort of dopamine-related addiction, whether it be formal ones like smoking or, some sort of like sugar type emotional eating behavior, whether it be staring at your phone and viciously scrolling a social media source, or double tapping, or checking your social media to see how many likes you get, or playing Candy Crush so you can see the explosions and your eyes light up like fireworks. That is all dopamine-based triggers. So it is to note that when you are craving something, step 1 is to change the description, right? I've been craving chocolate all day. No, you haven't. What you've been craving is dopamine, and your brain has learned over years and years of repetitive habit that when you give yourself chocolate, it gets dopamine, right? And that's really, really valuable, because then we can start this cool concept of, okay, what else spikes dopamine in my brain? And I present you the concept of the stress building team, or stress busting team. I apologize. So here's a fun analogy. I'm a basketball fan. Sorry if you're not, but on a basketball team, if you have one really good player, you don't win a championship, right? You need multiple good players to be competitive. The same is true when you're combating stress as the opponent. If you have one good player, which for many people is emotional eating, right? Is stress-related eating, is sugar or some sort of go-to feel-good food, right? That is not going to be enough to beat stress, right? So what ends up happening is you wear down and you abuse just that one opposition, or that one that one player on your team. Just like LeBron James played for the Cleveland Cavaliers, never got anyone around him, carried the team for years and years until he was so beat up and frustrated that he left his hometown. And what did he do? He got some other good players on his team, and then he won a couple championships. And so the thought is the same here. If food is your only stress buster, you're likely going to watch yourself eat more and more and more, rely on it more and more and more, and never feel like it's enough, because it's just not going to be enough to actually overcome that stress. But we can pair it with things. And so the main sources of dopamine in our brain are laughter, and joy, human connection, and personal accomplishment, as well as what we call normal stress relief, but we'll call it like self-care. I like to call them the exhales. So anything that you do in a random day that afterwards you go, and you get that really good, like actually like deep breath that actually like went through your whole lungs. And when you relax, you actually feel some muscles let go that were real tense before. Anything that causes that spikes dopamine. Anything that makes you feel joy spikes dopamine. Anything that is a human connection or interaction, some laughter, some positive human interaction. So not screaming at your kids to go to bed, not debating with your spouse about bills, positive, joyous human interaction, right? And then from there, we have personal accomplishment, which is actually one of my favorites because most people don't really like understand that one, but it's anything that makes you a little bit proud of yourself. That's what hobbies are at the end of the day. Hobbies are an example of a personal accomplishment, like, look what I did, right? And whether that's rebuilding a car or building a ship in a bottle or putting together a puzzle. I mean, it really doesn't matter what it is. The concept is anything that feels like a personal accomplishment. For me, one of mine has always been planning trips, and COVID kind of took that one from me a little bit. But all the trips and travels that I've gone on over the years, I always booked those trips. And what would happen is if I needed a break in the day, I would pull up Expedia and I would look at flights, or I'd pull up a travel blog that I liked and I would read about a place I wanted to go and some cool sites to see while I was there. And when I got done with that, in the midst of a really long work day, I'd go, I got to do something for myself. That was cool. And that little moment, that's a dopamine spike. And so what we need to do is we need to take some time to identify what are some things that make me exhale and try and write 3 down. And what are some things that make me laugh, right? Whether it's quick comedy videos on YouTube, whether it's that one friend you text with and joke around with, whether it's memes on a social media page that you like, whatever it is, find a couple things that make you laugh. Human connection. Who are some people that you can rely on that give you a positive feeling? And we want to have those people on hand, whether it's through text message or FaceTime or actual real interaction. And then personal accomplishment. What are some little things that you want to chip away at for yourself? Have you always wanted to learn a new language? Which Duolingo, which is a local Pittsburgh company, is a gamified mobile app that has bright colors and explosions like Candy Crush, but teaches you how to say things in another language. And you can sit on the toilet at your office and do Duolingo for 5 minutes and go, you know, me gusto. And all of a sudden you speak Spanish, right? Like, it's great. These are all examples of things that give you little dopamine spikes. Where these come in handy is then you can start dopamine testing. You can start to do some of these things when your brain has a craving. You can go, basically what's going to happen is initially your brain's going to go stress response, sugar or chocolate or whatever the thing is. And you're going to then go dopamine, and then you get to insert something else. But here's the hack. Just like food wasn't enough on its own, any one of these things isn't going to be enough on its own. There's a reason it's called a team, and it's because we want to be able to bundle some of these things. I had a client a couple months ago, and we were working on this together, and this was such a cool moment where she goes, so I bought those little portion bags of chips so that I would just eat a portion whenever I wanted to have that salty, crunchy kind of thing. I said, yeah, that's great. And she said, but the other day, she's like, I got stressed. I went to go get my little bag of chips and it just wasn't enough. And so I went and I had a second bag. And I said, well, was that enough? And she said, yeah, it was. And I said, okay. So what you just told me is that your stress level requested 2 bags of chips. Well, what if it had been 1 bag of chips and a FaceTime with your grandson? Or what if it had been 1 bag of chips and a 5-minute comedy video on Dry Bar Comedy on YouTube? Or what if it had been 1 bag of chips and laying on a back massager while you ate them? These are all examples of 2 things, just like 2 bags of chips, that gave you dopamine. But once again, we gave it a teammate, so it didn't have to bring its own friend, right? We didn't leave it alone. And so we get this stress busting team. And I will tell you openly that last year I had a pretty stressful year, as many people did. And I built my stress busting team. And when I had those really rough nights where all I wanted to do was like come home and eat, because that was the easiest thing to do after a 14-hour day, right? My stress busting routine was hop in the jacuzzi tub, jets. Usually Rottweiler would come and lay next to it, and I'd be able to pet Rottweiler while I got my jacuzzi bath. And then I would hop out, dry off. and I would go into the big love sack, which is the piece of furniture that the Rottweilers are allowed to lay on, call them up, put the back massager on there, and I would lay on a back massager, pet my dogs, and watch something on Netflix on my phone. And that is what I called a stress busting bundle, right? Because all of that is dopamine. Interacting with an animal, that is a physical dopamine spike. Getting a back massage, that relaxation after a bath, that is a dopamine spike. Watching a bright, video, whatever show I was on at the time, that is a dopamine spike. That created a sensation of happiness. And here's what's really cool about it. So the version of me that came home burnt out, laid on the couch, started snacking, watched shows, probably fell asleep mid-show, woke up on the couch at 2 a.m., wandered upstairs, broken sleep, not hungry the next morning because I snacked and ate too late. You can hear where that's creating a pretty vicious cycle that breaks you down, right? That's perpetuating. The version of me that had the Rottweiler back massage Netflix snuggles, right? That actually set me up so that I was more relaxed, which meant I went to bed earlier and I slept more deeply, and I woke up with an appetite, and then I ate a breakfast that supported my body, and then I started my day better. So just like we can see one set of dopamine created a vicious cycle, the opposite created a prolific cycle. And so that's the key here, is we can absolutely unbundle things that have created sort of this negative feedback loop in our lives, and we can actually bundle other things together to replace them. And what ends up happening is, as I woke up and felt hungry and felt better, as my body and mind started to clarify, my brain reset that default, right? All of a sudden, where the brain would go food, the brain started to learn, wait, that was a negative response, right? Just like in your trigger. And wait a second, this thing that I did, this setup, this was really, really good. I really liked this. And then subconsciously, my brain started to feel stressed at 9 p.m. Go take a bath or go snuggle up on the love sack. So that's how we talk about this idea of, we can take that sort of trigger response and we can shift it from the things that we've gotten used to that have been defaulted that aren't supporting us well, and replace them with a bundle of things that support us better, and then allow our minds to actually get excited and addicted to them.
Yeah, the neural pathways work that way too. So what you did was made a new path for how you were going to manage that. The other piece that I would add as a final one on here for me is the self-compassion that we talked about last time. If we are able to give ourselves the space and time to nurture in whatever ways those look like without guilt, that's a gift to us. We are coping in a very healthy way, and a lot of times we don't make room for that. We think we don't deserve it, or we just don't put in the effort to do it. And the way that we interact with ourselves, for those who don't have each other, there are ways to get that same connective feeling with yourself. Even just putting your hands on your heart for a few minutes can release some of those chemicals, and being kind to yourself allows that those new pathways to be solidified.
I love that. So there you go. Challenge to everybody listening is to build your stress busting team. And what I would note is, try and pick from a couple of the categories, right? Get a few of the ones that are the exhales, whether that's a massage or a bath or a cucumber exfoliant wrap or whatever makes you feel happy and calm, right? Get some from the joy, get some from the social connection, get some from the personal accomplishment. Ideally, these are things that are quick, they're accessible, they're portable. They're not things that you can, that you have to like set aside time for. They're meant to be there for you as conveniently as food, because that's why food is used so often, is it's accessible and it's convenient and it's thoughtless a lot of the time. What's worth noting, things like exercise. A lot of people always say like, exercise reduces my stress. Absolutely it does. It might not always be the most versatile thing for a stress busting team, but it would go on the stress preventing team. So something to think about is, our brain has a certain amount of dopamine, and that means it has a certain amount of energy that it can expend before it hits rock bottom. Something like daily exercise habits raises that base level. So just for easy numbers, say you started every day with 10 dopamine, and when you got to 0 is when your brain said, give me the brownie or whatever it was. You having a daily exercise habit is going to mean your day starts with 12 dopamine. And so you're less likely to hit that crash. You having meal prepped or set yourself up to have good access to food that you're excited about and satisfies you physically, mentally, and emotionally, right? That's going to give you that extra boost to give you 13 dopamine. So there's daily habits that we can use that actually kind of boost our levels in the first place, so that we start with a higher baseline. And then these things, though, these small, quick things, they're the things that I can use between clients if I feel myself getting mentally drained, where, ooh, dopamine's at 7, ha ha ha, funny video, dopamine's back to 9. And then from there, we can build the team so that when we really feel burnt out, we can actually rejuvenate in a really, really positive and supportive way.
I think a really fun way to use this for you is as experiments, right? Let's test out how this goes this week as I try something else.
Yeah.
And then the self-failure stuff doesn't come in if it doesn't go the way that maybe we anticipated, because we're going into it neutrally and just seeing what happens.
That's well said. Yeah, this isn't something that just happens overnight, right? It's a long process of recognizing that you've gotten into a habit or routine, and that is very human of you. That's a fine thing. And the goal isn't to completely get rid of that habit necessarily. A lot of times food is still on the stress busting team, right? There's nothing wrong with a snack as a stress relief. It's just when it's alone. That's why I like that example of that client with the 2 bags of chips. Notice that my examples to her weren't, I can't believe you ate 2 bags of chips. Why didn't you do literally anything else? No, it's, well, maybe 1 bag of chips and a talk with your grandson would have been a good option. And it's like, oh yeah, that would have been really nice. Can you imagine her walking around, FaceTime in one hand, chatting with the grandson who's running around being a happy little baby, and then having a chip with it? That sounds like a really, really positive moment, right? That's a captured moment in time. And that sounds a whole lot happier than sitting by yourself eating chips. So we're looking for enhancements. And and what Michelle just said is this is a process. Get excited about learning it. And step 1 is translate the word craving of X food into craving of dopamine, brain asking for a pick-me-up. And so that's the piece. It's not that you have cravings for a specific food. It's that you've learned that that food gives you the pick-me-up. Well, let's have fun exploring what else can give you that pick-me-up. Let's see what positive habits can support you better than that pick-me-up, because that's what really ends up happening is a lot of times the thing that we default to, it's easy, but it might not always be the most effective, or it might come with that double-edged sword of, yeah, I did that and I felt good right afterwards, but then mentally or physically or emotionally, it just like threw me, right? Whether it was sugar that caused me to spike and crash in a really, really big way, or whether it was I ate something that ended up making me feel sick to my stomach later. We can hear where a lot of times those like acute fixes that we think are good have some sort of like unintentional consequence. And we don't need the guilt to be the consequence, right? We tend to flagellate ourselves and make ourselves feel bad. Well, to be honest, the consequence is probably that physically you didn't set yourself up to feel your best, so you don't feel your best. Let's learn from that feeling, and let's more importantly find something else that sets you up to feel better, right? Let's build ourselves up, not tear ourselves down. Cool. Well, we took up that hour solid. We are absolutely going to use some time for questions, though. I will not take that from all of you. If we still have anybody even on, we actually can't see how many people are even listening. So if I hope we haven't been talking to a blank screen for a solid 25 minutes, because this was gold as far as I'm concerned. But anybody want to type questions in the chat? Anybody to unmute if that's even an option? It is to be the director behind the curtain. References, science. Do we have any questions? Anybody feeling bold? Oh, stop sharing. That's what you said. There it goes.
I have a question.
We got one? That's what I like to hear.
So one of the habits that I have that I'm finding hard to break is I'm cooking healthy and I'm eating right and I'm exercising, but I love to have a glass of wine or beer while I'm cooking. That's like, it's not as many beers or wines as happy hours, so I see it as okay, but I'm excited to have that as I'm cooking. So I'm associating that positive response of having a glass of wine or beer while I'm cooking something healthy, which it probably negates it. But so I guess I'm looking for some suggestions to break that. And I've tried like different bubblies. I've tried the kombucha. I've tried some different things. So just curious to hear your opinion. You're on mute.
Cool. First of all, I love that one. And I think what I would note is I think sometimes we're too critical of a glass of wine. I actually don't think that that's a bad habit. So one of the questions that I don't want to, if you don't feel comfortable sharing more detail about this, please feel obligated to do so. But do you feel like that habit is holding you back in some way, or what do you feel like that's holding you back from?
Well, so I've had some health issues pop up this year. And so I should not be drinking. I think you're on mute.
I couldn't hear you on the first part.
Oh, okay. So can you hear me now? So I've had a couple of health issues pop up this year, and I shouldn't be drinking because of it. And so I'm trying really hard to cut that out. And yeah, so that's why I'm looking for the suggestions.
Perfect. No, that's very helpful. Because what I was going to say is that base, one glass of wine, whether you're looking at it from calories or alcohol content or any of those things, isn't going to be a big make or break, and actually can be somewhat of a nice thing. But if there's medications or a medical reason where alcohol needs to be abstained from, I think you were on the right track with my first recommendation, but I would want to pizzazz it up a little bit. So you mentioned the bubblies and like those kind of things. That's kind of like when someone comes into my office and says, I really love eating Cheez-Its at night. And that'd be the equivalent of me saying, why don't you just eat celery instead? Right? Like, that's terrible advice. Like, you don't eat Cheez-Its because it's crunchy. You eat Cheez-Its because it's cheesy, right? So at the end of the day, like, it's fake cheesy, which is even somehow more addictive than cheesy, but I digress. Science. But the point is replacing something as aromatic and enjoyable as a glass of wine that your palate has gotten used to with something like a bubbly, which is flavorless in a lot of ways, right? It's just not going to be the same thing. But what I think we can do is we can see where we get to ask a fun question, which is, what can we use bubbly as a base for to create some sort of mocktail? And so there's some opportunity that you could become a bartender without the alcohol, so to speak, right? We could have some fun with a lot of virgin drinks. I will note that instead of the bubblies, there's those sparkling ice drinks that have a lot of flavor to them, and there's all sorts of different ones. And when you pour them over ice cubes, they actually tend to have that sort of flavor or that taste of sort of like a fun drink. I know that, what's the one? I like the ginger lime, and it has like a Moscow Mule taste almost to it. But you can use the bubblies, and you could muddle up some blueberries. We could even make it really easy on you. And you know those little Mio, they're like the little flavor enhanced squirt bottles. If you add a little bit of a Mio to a bubbly, you end up with a really refreshing beverage. They have 100 flavors now. And something like that can be a little bit more refreshing. You could even squeeze lime or orange or something into it. And so it becomes a game of, if you look up basically what we call like virgin cocktails or mocktails, there are a ton of options. And that would be a fun way to still have sort of that, what we call that process, because there's something therapeutic in the bottle of wine about opening it, the process of pouring it, right? Letting it breathe. Like, you got to realize that it's not just as simple as drink. There's a lot of things that are in that really have value. One of the ones that pops in my head beyond that is tea, because tea is another process type drink. And right, you brew it, you let it sit, you let it steep, you tend to sip it a little bit more slowly. And there are a lot of flavors that come in tea, and there can be additions of honey or agave or something light like that that can be useful. And again, it's not something that we drink quickly. It's something that is meant to create a relaxing and sort of therapeutic side. So sometimes when you're looking at replacing a habit, we've got to step back and actually look at what are the parts of that that actually create the positive feeling. And for a glass of wine, it's not necessarily even the wine itself as much as it is what I'd call the process of it, would be my idea for you. And so the process of making a mocktail could be a fun one, just like someone that comes home and has makes a Manhattan or a dirty martini, right? Same concept. Or someone that comes home and makes tea as a way to wind down. So I think you're on the right track with beverage replacement, but I think that I would go, man, let's have some fun with making that beverage so that you can sip something while you're enjoying, making your dinner. And that becomes a nice bundle.
And this may be a projection on my part about the meal prep. Do you enjoy cooking? Okay, so this is like an added ritual in there.
Yes.
You're taking something you already enjoy and ritualizing it and making this whole process. And I think that fits really consistently with what Andrew said. My advice would be different if you were like, no, I hate it, and that's why I need the wine.
That's an awesome point.
No, I love to cook, but
that's that idea of, we can hear where if you like the process of cooking, you enjoy the process of the wine. That is what we'd call something that's actually a positive stress outlet for you. And that's why the first question I asked when you said, you said this, and I said, well, what's wrong with the wine, is because I heard this as a positive. This wasn't I come home after a day and so I don't hit my kids, I drink a glass of wine, right? Like that's where we're like, maybe we do need to replace that wine. You know what I mean? But it had a positive kind of connotation to it already. And so we want to make sure that we don't lose the benefits of it when we're making this change.
Thank
You have
you.
another question. That's what I like to hear. People are getting chatty.
Do we have any book recommendations?
That's a good question.
Let's see. Do you have one off the top of your head?
Oh yeah.
Okay, I was going to say we might have to pull from
I'm a book nerd.
the bookworm.
Atomic Habits by James Clear is a great one.
Yeah, Atomic
Also,
Habits for sure.
The Power of Habit by
Charles Duhigg. That's the one that I would recommend.
Yeah.
I love The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. That's a really, really good one. I'm trying to think of, there was one that I read. Oof. I will, if you are a nerd. There's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by David Kahneman, and he is a Nobel Prize winner. He is one of the most renowned observational psychologists and behavioral economists in the world. And he is the one that basically mastered the idea of type 1, basically system 1 and system 2 in our brain, which is our instinctive brain and our thinking brain, and how those two interact and create habits and biases in our brain. It is a 540-page manifesto of his research based 40 years of behavioral research. It's fascinating. I've learned more from that book than probably any other book I've ever read in my life. I will say openly, I consider myself to be a moderately intelligent person, and I had to reread most of the pages. I had to read through it and then stop and go, okay, what did he just say? So that I could actually retain it. Because it kind of reads like the conclusion part of a research paper. It's very, very dense. A sentence has way more meaning than a sentence should at times. And again, you might read it and be like, man, this kid must be a slow reader. So I'll fully preface that, but that book comes to mind as a really good one as well.
And if it's boring, then Insomnia Cure. If you want some books related to emotional stuff, there are two that come to mind. One is called The Upside of Stress by Kelly McGonigal. She's amazing. She's got lots of podcasts too, if you don't want to commit to a whole book. And the other one is called Organize Your Feelings, Optimize Your Life. And it talks about the emotional decoding process, kind of getting into that labeling or noting technique that I talked about earlier. It talks about us having different parts of our psyche, not like multiple personalities, but a part of us that likes, autonomy, and a part of us that's relational. And it may just give you some foundational stuff on the emotional part.
Beautiful. The only other one I'll add is there's a really short read. It's 100 and some pages. It's called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And then in parentheses, it's all small stuff. And that's a really good stress management read. I'm trying to think, there was a book that I read that was really good about dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphin. And oh man, if I think of it, I'll have to put it in I'll have to do an email blast. I'm blanking off the top of my head, but that was actually a book that I utilized back when. So it's been a minute since I've read that one.
The one you said was really dense. You said that was Thinking Fast and Slow.
Thinking Fast and Slow, David Kahneman. Yeah, it has a big pencil on the front of it.
We have someone raise their hand. Delana, did you want to unmute yourself and say your question?
Okay, my question is, actually it's more of a comment or concern. I lost my dad in September. Not in September, in April, and then an uncle, and then I had to have surgery. So I've just kind of been through a series of things, and my appetite is all over the place. And initially I was doing really well. I was down almost 30 pounds, and now I'm either not hungry. Like I can get up in the morning and not be hungry, go through the day, lunchtime, dinner time, and I'll get hungry sometimes at dinner time. And then other days I'm starving. And then some days I can eat a little but not a lot. My since all of this, and my emotions have also been all over the place. So I can honestly say that my eating habits are all over the place. They've changed. Um, I'm not a snacker. Like I don't do a lot of sweet stuff. I've been having cravings for sweets, a lot, and I just don't do that. Like my sis and then prior to my dad dying, I had COVID really bad. So then my appetite was totally jacked up from that. So, but it seems to me like, I don't know, my mind is off, my eating habits is off, my body is off. I've picked up some of the weight, but I'm definitely not where I was. So I'm happy for that. But even during this time, I'm still constantly mindful of the foods that I've been eating, or what I'm about to eat. I'm still looking at calories and checking everything and weighing everything. Well, I won't say everything. I'll say most things, but it's just, I'm just off right now. I think you're muted.
Unmute myself. Cool. First, thank you so much for asking this question and also feeling safe sharing with us. I'm sorry to hear about your dad, and it sounds like a rough year was a really, really rough year. So I'm really excited to be able to maybe give you some little thoughts on this. If we step back of what you're dealing with right now, what we can hear is there's been a lot of volatility in your life, right? There's been a lot of up and a lot of down, a lot of emotions, right? And I like to think of it, instead of ups and downs, as sort of a pendulum swinging, right? There's been a lot of this way and that way. I don't want to hit you in the face, but but it's been swinging pretty hard. It might hit her in the face. It's swinging so hard. And our stomach, our intestine, our digestive tract is tied to our mood. We have a gut brain highway that tells us whether or not it's safe to eat right now. And so what you actually kind of said this yourself, your appetite seems to be reflecting your emotional state, right? Which is the back and forth. So sometimes you have no appetite because you're stressed and you're in it. And then sometimes after a long period of stress, when your body is finally able to rest, it says, recover, eat, feed, and then you end up eating a lot of food, right? And then because you ate a lot of food, you're overly full. So then you go an extended period where you don't need food. And so then you go back to that hunger. And so we kind of have this sort of what we'll call, it's not intentional restriction, but it's a period of restriction, right? Followed by a period of abundance. And we kind of go back and forth. And it ends up giving us volatility in your energy because food is your fuel. So you have periods where you have a ton of fuel that overwhelms the body. And then you have periods where you're running out of fuel and it's crashing the body. And so when we have this back and forth, and we can hear it, emotional back and forth, appetite back and forth, the first thing that we want to do is, whenever you have a pendulum swinging, the answer isn't to pull it one side or pull it to the other side. The answer is to stop it in the middle. And when we do that is what I like to call the dominoes of hunger. You don't have hunger consistently, and that's the key. We want to get back to that. And where that comes from is from consistent eating. And initially we think, but I'm not hungry enough to eat. And it's exactly right. And that's why it feels like a catch-22. But the way that we can create that is by putting in our dominoes. So what I want to do with you first is basically get you into a habit of, when are we going to eat? And ideally, would we eat? Like, look at your day and think, okay, in an ideal world, if I had hunger that was consistent, right, when would it make sense? Would I be eating a breakfast? Let's just say, for example, I don't know, 9 a.m., right? Let's say, well, I have a breakfast at 9 a.m. I'd have a lunch between 12 and 1. I'd eat a snack around 4, and then I'd have a light dinner at 7. Let's just say that works. You mentioned that you're not a snacker, so maybe it's more of a breakfast, lunch, dinner, right? So, I'd want to eat my breakfast by 8. I'd want to get a lunch at noon. I'd want to get dinner earlier because it's hot outside and I don't feel like eating heavy late. So I'd eat something around 5 and I'd be done. Whatever it is for you, plant those posts in your day And then for a week, eat something at each of those posts. And so first week, you might wake up not hungry. Skipping the meals is the thing we don't want to do. Instead, eat a handful of blueberries, eat a half a banana, have a couple crackers, have a handful of Cheerios, eat just something small, right? And what's going to happen is that meal isn't going to be quite enough, which means it's going to create a little bit of hunger at the next meal. So then all of a sudden you get to eat that meal. And then that's going to set up so your body starts to burn a little bit faster. And then you're going to find yourself maybe the first day not very hungry for that next meal. So you eat something small again, bowl of oatmeal, bowl of cereal, little half sandwich, something light. And that's going to create hunger the next morning. And then you're going to eat a breakfast and then a lunch. And so basically if we set the posts down and then we actually eat something, even if it's just something teeny at them over the course of the week, which you'll be training your body to do, is you'll be training it to anticipate its hunger, which means you'll start to feel consistent hunger. And that consistent hunger will lead to consistent eating. That consistent eating will lead to consistent energy and consistent digestion and consistent mood stability. And it'll give you something that you can physically feel like, oh, good, this isn't going back and forth. This isn't one thing in my life isn't rocking anymore. It'll give you that pillar of stability. And in that stability, we're going to be able to find stability for other things. And so that'd be my challenge for you. And I'd encourage you to email us. You can always email me personally if you want, or if you work with one of the dietitians on the team, don't hesitate to reach out to them as well. But a lot of times when we're feeling out of sorts, it's always a good chance to just set what I call your pillar meals in. And even if the first week you ate a handful of Cheerios for breakfast, a half a banana for lunch, and a piece of toast for dinner, right? We don't need to judge what it is or how much it is. Let's just try and make sure it exists so that your body can start to trust that it's going to get fed consistently, and then it's going to respond to that consistent energy offering.
I would just add to for you to, the stages of grief are not linear. And, having had a similar loss, there were times like throughout the same day where I was like, fine, and then bawling, and then I'm like, I have to go teach a class. So I think learning to honor your feelings and that sticky note technique with the labeling, like grief, anger, sadness, apathy, just labeling without judgment, kind of like a label maker or sticky notes, recognize feeling sometimes hunger as well, because there are sometimes when it's not really convenient for us to have a meltdown, and life doesn't work that way, but we do need to make space for those feelings.
I have one longer question.
Thank you so much.
Get a little Adriana says, I have a question not related to cravings, but she's about to go on her first appointment with Lane. She is training for her first 50K on trails. The longest she's ever run is a road marathon. She said she's gaining weight, though not eating much anymore. She said, everything tells me this is normal. Do you think it's normal? I started looking at what I eat in the past 10 days and we'll discuss at my appointment. But all my long distance running friends seems to think it's normal, especially for women to gain weight during endurance training for a long event. #frustrating.
Well said. So here's a fun one. Back when I was just a lowly dietitian by myself, screaming from the rooftops trying to help the world, I did a marathon ready runner's guide and a blog actually for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And the very first article I wrote for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was titled, "Training for a Marathon? Don't expect to lose weight." And the reason for that is the type of training you're doing is very muscle building. Trail running requires your ankles, your hips, all of your joints to have improved tendon and ligament around them. It requires extra muscle that are lateral because of stability. So a lot of your stability muscles need engagement, and the level of endurance you're going through. Your body needs more muscles so that the muscles are around to give you the stamina that exists. And so when you have someone going from a road race to a trail race, I always expect at least 3 to 5 pounds of muscle to come on during training. And then from there, we got to realize that's before we consider the wear and tear, which is exercise of any kind, whether you're doing 20 sit-ups or whether you're doing 30 miles. is literally taking a muscle that's these long strands and tugging on them and expecting them to tug back. And that's what we call a muscle contraction. And when you tug on them, well, let's see, just for fun, the average mile is 2,000 steps. And so that means each hamstring gets 1,000 tugs a mile. And if you're doing a 20-mile run, you're giving this muscle 20,000 tugs. What ends up happening is that muscle starts to get damaged and it starts to tear apart. It doesn't tear like injury tear, it micro tears. And those little teeny holes in the muscle pull water and carbohydrates and protein into the muscle. And that's an inflammatory response. And that muscle swells up and then it fixes itself, grows back stronger. And that's what becomes muscle density, right? So we have two things. We have the long-term effect, which is the actual muscles growing, right? And then we have the short-term, which is the muscles in an inflammatory phase. When you're training, you train so consistently, the inflammatory process takes 72 hours. So if you're running more than once every 3 days, that means your inflammatory processes are getting interrupted by the next inflammatory stimulus, right? So you run, muscles get torn, they're swollen, and then they're starting to heal. And then the next day you run again, and then you run again, and then you run again. And so during training, you end up kind of like a giant ball of water, to be honest. And that's where most women in particular notice where it's not fat accumulation, but they feel soft, or they feel like they're holding water under their skin. They might say, oh, I feel like watery in my legs and in my abdomen. I feel puffy might be the word that gets used. And that is a cumulative inflammatory response from basically like overload training. And something to remember, extreme athletes, so like extreme endurance, for example, ultra marathons and that kind of stuff, aren't a health choice, right? They're extreme, which is to say that they overwhelm the body. So what you're doing is something that physically overwhelms the body. It's not a bad thing, but it's to say that we would expect the body to respond in a pretty dramatic way. And that's in the form of radical levels of inflammation initially, because it's like, what the hell are you trying to do? That's the first response. And then from there, it's like, I better catch up and figure out how to fix this, because if this is what our life is now, I've got some work to do. And that's where it gets to work building that muscle. So right now you're in a phase where you're building muscle tissue and you're holding a whole bunch of water as kind of the scaffolding. So think of, when you build a building, right? There's the building, and so that's your muscle. And then there's the scaffolding that we use to kind of protect the building while we're building it. That's the inflammatory phase. So right now you're constructing a new building that's bigger than the one before, and you have a bunch of scaffolding around it. And so it's heavier and it's going to be heavier. Where Lane is going to be extremely valuable is, one, she's fantastic at this. She's a sports dietitian. She is my right hand when it comes to sports dietetics, has been for 4 years. But also she's going to tell you the exact same thing I just did. And we're going to also be able to do something like take body fat for you. So you'll be able to see what really happens with athletes, especially extreme athletes. Extreme athletes rarely get lighter initially. Extreme athletes usually get a little bit heavier, but when they look at their body composition, there's a lot more muscle. And that means that fat is actually depleting. And so I pretty much guarantee that what's currently happening is your body fat percentage is gradually creeping down because you're tapping into energy reserves, right? You're running long distances, and body fat is energy for when you need it, right? So your body's going to tap into that reserve a little bit, but you're also building muscle. So you have one thing that's causing the scale to technically trend down, but it's being hidden by something that's the scale actually trending up, as that development. So all good things. It's actually a reason to not weigh yourself, because the scale is one of the most useless things for an athlete. It rarely tells us anything, because the average female is 25% to 30% body fat. But let's flip that and realize that the average female is 70 to 75% water and muscle and bone. Those things all fluctuate much more dramatically than fat mass. Fat is an organ that gradually ebbs and flows based on need. Your water balance fluctuates 5 to 6 pounds a day, right? 2% a day. So you're going to see the scale fluctuate from water much more consistently than you're going to see the scale fluctuate from fat mass changes. So I pretty much guarantee you're leaner. The reason you don't feel lighter is because of the water retention under your skin. As you get caught up and as your body enters that phase of training where it actually has its base, a lot of that water flushes out. You start to feel lighter and tighter and leaner. And just keep in mind that we rarely feel body fat coming on because body fat isn't right under our skin, and it doesn't come on aggressively. You can hold 6 pounds of water from an intense run easily. And so think about, 2 pounds of water is this big Nalgene. I could literally have you out a long run. You would hold 6 or 3 of these bottles under your skin. That's going to feel like, oh my gosh, why do I feel so much bigger? Why do I feel so much puffier? Well, that's your body's inflammatory response, and it's responding to an extreme sport, which is pretty cool and pretty fantastic if you let it be. Cool. 8:32. So we capped it. We actually timed this thing pretty well. I'm proud of us. So big hand to everyone in attendance. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you got some good things to walk away with. We're going to be picking another date to do another one of these. We try and do these about every 6 weeks. If you have any thoughts for topics you want to hear Michelle and I dive into together, please drop us a line, send us an email, let us know. We're always looking for good ideas for concepts that people want to dig into. And again, we'll be posting this thing on YouTube here in the coming week or so you can rewatch and all that good stuff.
Thanks so much for hanging in with us.
Absolutely. Wonderful.